Hi, everyone. For those of you, I know most of you, this is a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Leonora Henson, and I'm the Curator, Director of Public Programming here at Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural site. On behalf of our Board of Trustees and our staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to Speaker Night. I'd especially like to welcome Dr. Shana M Guderian, who is our guest speaker this evening. Speaker Night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to come in and help us think about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency and continue to be relevant today. The TR Site's Speaker Night series is made possible by the generous support of M&T Bank as well as the New York State Council on the Arts, NYSCA. So thank you very much to both groups. I should also mention that NYSCA's support has enabled us to record all of our speakers, not only this year, but also last year. So if you've missed any of them, I hope you will check out the recordings on our YouTube channel. As I already mentioned, we are joined this evening by Shana M Guderian, who co-authored Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. Dr. Gadarian is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She earned a PhD in politics from Princeton University and also has a BA in political science from Rutgers University. Prior to her appointment at the Maxwell School, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy Research at the University of California, Berkeley. Her primary research interests are American politics, political psychology, political communication, and experimental methods. The interests that motivate Dr. Gadarian's research is how the tone and content of the political media environment influences the way in which Americans seek political information and form opinions. She's particularly interested in how citizens learn and form attitudes when politics is threatening, whether those threats come from terrorism, public health outbreaks, or media and elite rhetoric. As I mentioned, she co-authored Anxious Politics with Bethany Albertson from the University of Texas. The book explores how anxiety over policy issues like immigration, public health, terrorism, and climate change affect how Americans seek political information, their trust in government, and public opinion. Her newest project, which is funded by the Norwegian Research Council, has her working with a cross-national group of scholars from Norway, Finland, and Spain. They are exploring the effects of terrorism on social capital, societal resilience, and public opinion across 4 countries. Having said that, I'm delighted to turn the podium over to Shana M Guderian. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks for the warm welcome and the invitation to come here and share this research. So I'm going to talk mostly today about the book project, Anxious Politics. You can purchase it on Amazon if you're interested after the talk, if I interest you enough. And I'm going to talk through some of the research, and then I'm happy to take questions throughout or at the end about how about the applications of this argument for contemporary politics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So it's not hard to open a newspaper or Twitter or go on television or open a magazine and see issues that are scary. That are either it's the melting ice caps, or it's immigration, or terrorism, or the world getting warmer and weather getting more extreme. And if it's not the media telling us that there are things that we should be afraid of in politics, politicians themselves are pretty good at telling us that we should be afraid. Okay, so these are some stills from some of my favorite presidential ads. This one is the classic bear ad. I don't know if you remember, this is a Reagan ad about the bears in the woods and the bears communism. And this is the classic LBJ Daisy ad, which is very subtle in saying we must love each other or we must die as a nuclear bomb explodes. Again, very subtle message intended to make you feel fearful, only aired once. Okay, this is an ad about that George W. Bush ran in 2004 about terrorism. So again, if it's not the media telling us that we should be afraid, it's political elites themselves. And the argument that we make in this book is that the anxiety that we feel about politics has consequences for how we understand politics, who we trust, the kind of media that we seek out, and what kinds of policies we want. So even fake newscasters, this is Stephen Colbert when he was a fake newscaster, attempted to keep us frightened. And our current administration uses a lot of the rhetoric of fear, and I'm going to kind of circle back to this and think about the consequences of this. If you look at some of the language that Trump uses in the 2015 RNC, he talks very much and continues to talk about a world in crisis that is out of control and that you should feel anxious about. Our convention occurs at a moment of crisis for our nation. The attacks on our police and terrorism in our cities threaten our very way of life. Any politician who does not grasp this danger is not fit to lead our country. So we're going to, again, our book was published prior to 2016, but I'm happy to talk again in Q&A about how we think this travels forward in time. And in 2018, the State of the Union has similar kinds of themes. This is about open borders that have allowed drugs and gangs to pour into our most vulnerable communities. They've allowed millions of low-wage workers to compete for jobs and wages against the poorest Americans and the loss of innocent lives. So again, this thread of anxiety goes through much of the rhetoric of the current administration, and it is intended to get you to support a set of policies that this administration, like previous administrations, will argue are there to protect you. And that is the intention of making you feel anxious. So that we're on the same page, we rely on a definition from Einstein's 1992 work that anxiety, and you probably know this from your experience, anxiety is unpleasant as an emotion, okay? It is of what we would call aversive, and it is intended, it is evolutionarily developed to try to get you to see threats in the environment. Anxiety is there for a purpose. It makes us feel uncertain because there may be threats in the environment. Now, that doesn't mean it's always good for us, but it is anxiety as an emotion developed to try to keep people safe. So anxiety is there to tell you that there's a threat in the environment, and it makes you feel uncertain, and it leads you to want to deal with that emotion because it is unpleasant, okay? So that we're, again, on the same page. In the book, we talk about political anxiety. That is, anxieties that come from the world of politics and have political solutions. We're not here talking about interpersonal anxiety or kind of social anxiety. Just, we're political scientists. We kind of play psychologists on TV. Okay, but the argument that we make in the book, and I'm going to go through some of the tests of this argument, is that political anxiety is uncomfortable, right? When you hear something that there's a crisis in our streets, that there is crime, that there is terrorism, this is intended to lead you to want protection, okay? And it leads to support for policies and political leaders that people think will effectively protect them from the threats that are causing the anxiety in the first place, okay? It also leads us to want to seek information that can protect us from, again, the harms that are making us anxious. In the book, we look at 3 potential coping mechanisms that people might use when they are feeling anxious about politics, either because the anxiety was created from their own experiences, it was something they picked up in the media, it was something from interpersonal discussion, or it came from a political ad, right? There's lots of ways that people become anxious about politics, and we, in the book, create anxiety in our subjects in a variety of ways. So I would say I look like a nice person, but I spent 7 years scaring people about politics in labs, and I can tell you how to do that. It's actually not that hard. Politicians do it all the time. Okay, so we look at our expectation again is that when people are anxious, they want to cope with that anxiety, and there are many ways they can do that, and we look at 3. One is how they seek information in the media. The second is in trusting in government, who they trust. And the third is in political attitudes or public opinion. I'm going to focus on these second two of the three. I'm happy to talk about the political information seeking in Q&A, but I'm going to focus most of the rest of the talk on the trust and attitudes. Okay, so we look at 4 different areas of political anxiety. These are ones that are prevalent, were prevalent as we were writing the book, continue to be prevalent, were prevalent at the time of TR. So we look at the immigration, climate change, terrorism, and public health outbreaks. So things like smallpox, for instance. Okay. Now these fall into basically 2 camps, what we call unframed threats and framed threats. Unframed threats are threats that politicians do not need to do a lot of work to convince you that you should be worried about these things, okay? Terrorist attacks, for instance, floods, okay? But framed threats are more debated. These are ones where politicians have to do a lot more rhetorical work to convince you that there are harms that could come to you, or the harms are in the future. Things like immigration, for instance. And we can talk about in Q&A whether or not immigration is actually what we think of as a framed threat, or is maybe in this unframed and a little bit easier to make people anxious. So I'm not going to go through that, but the way in which we test the effects of anxiety are experimental, like I said. We recruit people to our studies and we randomly assign them to feel anxious or not about a political topic. And we do this in a variety of ways. I'm going to show you a couple of the ways. Now, why do we use experiments? Well, it is the case that people in the public are anxious about different kinds of issues. And so they may prefer different kinds of policies because of that anxiety. And we don't want to look at that relationship and conclude that the anxiety itself is causing that attitude if it's really some sort of pre-existing demographic. So women are concerned about an issue and they like a different kind of set of policies than men. And we don't want to say that it's the anxiety that's causing these policy preferences when in fact it is the demographics. Okay? So what we do is we randomly assign people to feel anxious or not about these issues, and then we can conclude that it's the anxiety itself rather than the pre-existing demographics that are causing them to be more supportive of a certain set of policies or to trust in different people. Okay, and we do this again in a variety of ways. I'm going to show you one where we use a newspaper story. We have ads. In some of our studies, we actually have people create their own anxiety by writing down what makes them anxious about an issue. Okay, so here our expectation is that anxiety actually can increase trust, but it only increases trust in people that you believe can actually mitigate the harms that are causing you to feel anxious. So it doesn't increase trust in everyone. It doesn't increase trust in government just generally. It increases trust in people who you think of as experts, okay? Now in some policy areas, it's easier to figure out who an expert is. So I'm going to show you one of our studies where we made people anxious about smallpox outbreak. Smallpox is eradicated, but we told our respondents that there was a current smallpox outbreak to make them anxious. And then we debriefed them at the end. We went through human subjects so that if you have any ethical concerns, happy to talk about that. But so in public health, it's pretty easy to figure out who the experts are. They're the people who work for health agencies, or they have doctor in front of their name, or they're public health experts in other ways. In our framed areas, it's a little bit harder to figure out who is it that on immigration I should trust, okay? And here's where, as political scientists, we use this concept of issue ownership. Okay, so you may not have heard of this concept before, but I think you intuitively understand it. The parties are seen as the owners, or that they are better on certain issues than others. Here, I'm not gonna let you cheat. I'm gonna go back. Okay. So if I told you that one party is seen as stronger and better on immigration, which party would you say that was? Oh no. The Republicans, for a long time, have had, now this is as of 2017, things have changed. But for a long time, the Republican Party had the issue ownership advantage on immigration. Okay? And terrorism, which party owns terrorism? Owns terrorism. Republicans. And if I said that the one party was better on education, which party would that be? Democrats. Right. So so parties know which issues they're better on. So this is from 2017. This is which party could do a better job dealing with terrorism. Here's the Republicans. All these are ones where the Republican Party has an advantage. Now, immigration is really interesting because issue ownership is actually pretty sticky. That is, over time, the parties don't really flip-flop very much. Immigration is one of those issues, and that's one I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A, about how we think these effects that we see now travel to 2018, the ones that we looked at, that we tested in 2011 when the Republican Party had pretty strong ownership over immigration. Okay. All right, so here's the study that we did in 2011. We have 600 people that we recruited from YouGov Polymetrics. This is an online representative panel. And we randomly assigned them to read one of 3 newspaper stories. And I'm actually just going to focus on these 2. But there was a control condition where we asked people to read a story that was not about smallpox at all. It was about something unrelated. And then we had 2 groups read about either a smallpox outbreak that had happened in 1980. Now, smallpox was eradicated in about 1980. And so this was framed as like this was the last outbreak in Cleveland, Ohio. And then we had a third of our respondents read about a current ongoing smallpox outbreak. Okay, so the idea here is by telling people that there is a current outbreak, we are trying to make them anxious. That was the goal. Okay? And we did this through a newspaper story that looked like it came from the New York Times, and there's this picture of someone who's kind of in a hazmat suit, okay? And then we asked them how they were feeling afterward, if they were feeling worried or anxious or angry, and I'll show you that we were successful in making them anxious, okay? And then we asked them questions about who they trusted to provide information about smallpox. And then we also asked them several questions about civil liberties. Okay, that essentially, if there were a smallpox outbreak, should things like the government mandate vaccinations, or should people with smallpox be put into quarantine against their will? We were interested in, again, if people want to feel protected, if anxiety is leading people to feel protected, they might want government to have more control over a smallpox outbreak that may come at the risk of taking away civil liberties from people. Okay? So that was the intention of these 2 questions. Okay. I can tell you about the sample if you want, but the important thing to note is this is how strongly do you feel anxious, and the scale was an 8-point scale, but we rescaled it from 0 to 1, and so higher bars mean more anxiety. So yay, in our smallpox present condition, we made people more anxious. That was the goal. And it was successful. Okay. Then we asked them, who do you trust to provide you information about smallpox? Okay, and I'm just circling, and we asked them a bunch of people, both who are relevant and irrelevant, right? The IRS is on here, right? And Oprah, who thinks she's a health advocate, but is not in fact a doctor, okay? So what we find is, and I'm circling the ones here that are kind of statistically significant, that for one thing to note is this is our smallpox outbreak condition, right? So the white circles make people more trusting of the CDC, of the Department of Health and Human Services, of the FDA, and Department of Homeland Security, which in most cases would be irrelevant, but the story here was about a biohazard. It was about smallpox being used as a biohazard. So we take this as evidence that, again, when you make people anxious, they want to seek out information and they want to put their trust in people who they believe can actually keep them safe. Okay? They're not turning to Oprah or the IRS. They are less likely to turn to people who are political. We have another, look, you can't tell here because we have another small manipulation where we describe the Surgeon General in a couple of different ways. When we describe the Surgeon General as a political appointee, anxiety doesn't increase trust in her. But when we describe the Surgeon General as a doctor with medical training in biohazards, we do increase trust in her. Okay? So this is, again, this is just the overall effect. Okay? So again, it's that people want to put their trust in people who they believe can actually keep them safe. Okay, so I did also show you that we asked about civil liberties as well. Okay, now all of the questions that we asked are what the WHO calls the best practices in an outbreak of infectious disease. That the government should have the ability to quarantine people, destroy property, put people in isolation. But these are relatively extreme things for governments to be able to do. And what we're showing is that when you make people more anxious, their support for these policies are higher than when they're less anxious. Okay? So again, they are best practices, but they also, people are saying, sure, you should be able to take my neighbor's property and destroy it if he or she has smallpox. Okay? Okay. So that's one of our public health studies. We have a couple of other ones, which again, I'm happy to talk about. But we have several immigration studies, and I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit through the immigration studies as well. Okay. So you may have seen many anti-immigrant or immigration ads or heard about kind of anti-immigrant messages. And what we did in this study was we randomly assigned people to watch one of two, and this is a separate sample, this is 1,000 people, again, a representative sample. What we're doing here is we're asking people to watch one of two anti-immigrant ads of the kind that you see from, this one is based on a 1994 ad from Pete Wilson from California, but these are fairly common, these anti-immigrant ads. What we do here to actually ratchet up the anxiety is that we add scary music, essentially. So we randomly assign people to watch one of two ads. The ads are identical except for the images and the music are intended to make you feel anxious in one version of it. And I'll show you the kind of anxiety producing ad, and then I'll give you a minute afterward if you feel anxious. Okay. So
It's how most of us got here. It's how this country was built. American citizenship is a national treasure. But today, 11 million illegal immigrants overwhelm our borders and our hospitals. Illegal immigrants take American jobs. Open borders bring crime and a threat to national security. Illegal immigrants take welfare, healthcare, and education dollars that should go to hardworking Americans. There is a right way to do things and a wrong way. Enough is enough. Say no to illegal immigration.
Okay, so that's the treatment ad, the one that's intended to make people anxious, and then the control ad is identical except without the music, and some of the pictures are slightly different. Okay. Again, the intention here is to make people anxious, but again, hold the content exactly the same. Okay, so this is a bit of a hard test. Again, our expectation is that when you make people anxious about immigration, they will be more trusting of the party that owns the issue, which again, in 2011, when we ran this study, was the Republicans. Okay? So after we randomly assigned people to watch one of these ads, we then asked people to rate their trust in 6 randomly ordered political figures to handle immigration. That's the same question as the kind of issue ownership. Okay, Barack Obama, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, citizen groups like the Minutemen. This was an Arizona Governor Jan Brewer was in the news a lot for stop and frisk, not stop and frisk, the stop and show us your papers, and U.S. Customs and Border Control. Okay, this is a 4-point scale. Okay, this is a little small, so I'll just walk you through it. So these are Democrats in black and Republicans in white here. Okay, so this is the effect of the scary ad itself on trust. Okay, so we don't make either Republicans or Democrats more trusting of the Border Control, Minutemen, or Jan Brewer. What we do is we make just the watching of that 30-second ad with the scary music makes both Democrats and Republicans more trusting of the Republican Party. Okay? And it makes Republicans less trusting of the Democratic Party and Obama. Okay? And the effects among Democrats are pretty muted. But I think this is what you should pay attention to, because this tells you something about the incentives that parties have to make you anxious about the issues that they are seen as strong on. If what I'm going to do is I'm going to run an ad that has scary music, and I'm going to make people, on the whole, more trusting of my party, I have every incentive to do that and to repeat it over time. Now, I will say that our studies are not of voters particularly. These are of people who are recruited into our studies. So it could be the case that people who are more attuned to politics are able to filter that information and not become anxious, and we have some evidence of that. But these are overall effects. Okay. So again, what we find is anxiety boosts trust in experts, people who are seen as who can handle the threat, but that political context can shape who the experts are. Okay. So we also ask, and I'm going to just briefly go through this, we also ask people whether or not, this is particularly undocumented immigrants, should have access, because the ad focus on undocumented immigrants, should have access to different social programs: emergency room care, elementary school, Medicaid, food stamps, and in-state tuition. Okay? And we look again at whether or not they are more supportive or less supportive. Our expectation is that people should become less supportive of access to social services for undocumented immigrants if they are in this kind of scary music ad condition. And that's what we find. Mostly the effects are among entitlement programs like food stamps and Medicaid. And these are not ones that undocumented immigrants actually get access to. I know you had Jamila Mitchner here last month talking about Medicaid. But these are, our effects are to move people to be less supportive of immigrants accessing social services when they're exposed to this 30-second ad. Okay? All right, so I told you I talked just briefly about the current administration. And so one of the questions you might have is, we have been looking at anxiety about one issue at a time. And so the question is, can you actually apply anxiety about one issue to other issues? And the answer is yes, you can. So this is the call for that Donald Trump made in December 2015 for a shutdown of Muslims, right? So this is about, and the argument for that is about national security. Okay? So the argument is that you should be concerned about terrorism and national security, and this should have an effect on immigration policy. Okay? So if you look at the American National Election Studies, which is a large quadrennial study of American voters, and you look at how worried they said they were about a major terrorist attack in the United States, and then how warmly they felt toward Trump and Clinton, okay? There's not very much of an impact among Republicans or Democrats, but here's where the big finding is, right? Among people who are the more concerned you were about terrorism in 2016, and you were an independent, the more warmly you felt toward Donald Trump, and the less warmly you felt toward Hillary Clinton. Okay? Now this isn't experimental proof, but this is an association, right? And again, it should tell you something about the incentives that the current administration has to keep talking about things that are scary, like terrorism. Now there are scary things out in the world, but there are also, the argument that this administration makes is because there is a potential for terrorism, that you should pursue a set of policies like shutting down sanctuary cities or travel ban. And you should continue to hear them talk particularly you see the president talking in the terms of chaos and scariness and protection, right? And that's what you see. When you see after the sanctuary cities ruling, this says that San Francisco is putting the well-being of criminal aliens before the safety of our citizens, and the blood of dead Americans is on their hands, right? This, in talking about the travel ban ruling, it's about protecting the homeland and protecting the American people. Again, this rhetorical kind of meshing of things that are scary with the argument about protection is not unique to Donald Trump. He just happens to do it really, really well. Okay. So again, I'm going to wrap up. I'm happy to take your questions. So famed political philosopher Jeb Bush there are a lot of people who say that we shouldn't have emotion in politics. Right? Our politics, and Jeb Bush is not alone. Certainly, our founding fathers were not actually particularly supportive of having an emotional politics. And we don't take a normative stance in this book on whether or not anxiety in politics is a good thing or a bad thing. There are some good things. There are some things that are good about it. There are some definite costs to an emotional politics. But politicians know the power that emotion has, and we should understand it as well. And what we are doing in this book is arguing that anxiety is consequential for contemporary politics, and that it is going to increase support for experts and a desire for protection. And there is going to be a political fight over what should make you anxious, but also what are the policies that can protect you. Okay. So I'm going to turn to your questions, and happy to hear them.
So, segue, obviously the idea of fear was very prevalent during the beginning of World War II when Roosevelt used we have nothing to fear but fear itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that nobody can say that anymore, that what they want to say is you need to fear itself. And why can't people say, why is it that we are not able to get past that now? Why don't we have, I guess this is what we need, why don't we have a person out there who can really cut through all of this fear-mongering and really present a strong argument that this is fear-producing?
Sure. Okay. So there's a couple of things to unpack here. One is that FDR said we shouldn't fear itself, but also that we should be concerned about Japanese Americans enough that we should intern them, right? So at the same time, when politicians are saying we don't have anything to fear in Europe, we have it, but we should fear this domestic threat, right? So no politician is, even the Obama 2008 campaign, which is considered, right, if you think of what's the image that you think of in the Obama 2008 campaign, right? So this image of him, the poster of him where it says hope. If you look at what the kind of tone of the ads in the 2008 campaign, they were actually fairly negative, and more so than the years before that. Politicians are pretty risk averse, right? And they see that fear mongering is actually pretty powerful, and therefore, why not use it, right? So you do see some examples of certainly politicians talking about things that you shouldn't be worried about because they don't want to deal with it or they think it's overhyped, right? So we can think of Obama's reaction to Ebola, right? It was actually to tell people, calm down. And then the criticism of Obama and others who say things like that is that they don't care enough and they are not concerned enough, right? So there is this, politicians pay a much bigger price for not doing something than for doing something. The other part of my answer would be that the media environment in 2018 is very different than in 1940, right? We have many fewer newspapers. Newspapers are much less fear-mongering now than they were than television, okay? But we have many fewer newspapers now than we did in the 1930s and 40s. And we have a very competitive news environment where everyone is competing for your clicks, for your eyes, for your attention. And what that leads to is actually a media environment that's pretty sensational. So even if politicians want you to calm down, the media is telling you, don't calm down, right? So I always say, there's this example. Our local, one of our local news stations in Syracuse has a segment that they call the fugitive of the week. Right, so the crime rate in Syracuse is not any higher than, say, other places, but this is a very typical kind of local news type of segment to tell you that there's something that's going to hurt you, something going to kill you. Tune in at 11 and we'll tell you what it is, right? So there are a couple of reasons I think that it's not hopeless, right? But I do think there's some incentives here that politicians have, that the media have, that make fear seem like it's the one thing that we should kind of rely on.
Kind of going on that point, I was wondering if kind of the media, and especially the cable kind of news networks, who are in their attempts to kind of talk about issues using an expert from one side and an expert from another side, despite the fact that perhaps what the scientific community believes is more completely represented by one of those people as opposed to the second. Does that kind of false equivalency impact the way people view the experts and who they can trust?
So the idea, so this is particularly an issue with climate change. It's less the issue now, but certainly in the early kind of coverage of climate change, the idea that you should bring on a scientist and then also a climate skeptic to try and reach some balance would suggest that the climate skeptic, even if that person is a scientist, is in the mainstream when that's not actually true. And so that would tell you that these people are both experts. So I think that may be problematic. I think in a lot of political issues, not every political issue has a kind of owner, someone who's an owner, and so if there's and so those are areas where there may be some contestation over who the expert is, and so there people may rely more on the person that they already believe is the expert. Right? So one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about is that we're not always able to make people anxious about politics. So we have several studies in our immigration studies where we're not able to make, we have one study where we have equal numbers of African Americans and Latinos and whites. And we're not able to make African Americans or Latinos anxious about immigration in the same way that we're able to make whites anxious about immigration. And so the argument that we make here is that people can use their own identities in filtering what should make them anxious. So if I'm someone who already cares about climate and I see that person who's purporting to be an expert and is trying to make me anxious or trying to tell me not to feel anxious, right? So that's kind of what climate skeptics do, is tell you don't worry, right? One, that's less effective. But I may be able to use my identity as a filter for who I would trust, okay? But that's not always the case, and it really depends on the kind of political communication. So it's much easier for people to identify that communication is trying to manipulate them and they should put their blinders on or they should use their identities as a filter when the communication is persuasive. That is an ad or a politician who's saying you should be anxious, right? I mean, you probably have experienced this yourself, listening to a politician who you don't like tell you should be worried about something and you saying, no, I don't trust you, I don't agree with you, I will not become anxious about X, Y, Z. But if you got that same message and it came from a friend who you like and you trust, or it came from a community leader that you trusted, or it came from the media in a source that you trusted, you may not put those blinders up, and that anxiety may filter through in more effective ways, right? And we find these differences, that's why we make people anxious in different ways, right? So when people create their own anxiety, it's much more effective across party lines. When we use a political ad, that's when people start saying, no, I don't believe that, I won't feel that way. Not everyone. But people can use their identities in that way, but much more likely when they know that they're trying to be manipulated.
In your research, did you come across any studies of fear and anxiety in Theodore Roosevelt's era? Like, I'm thinking especially of the muckrakers and how they did a great public service with bringing to the forefront abuses in the meat packing industry and monopolies, but the leadership of bringing that information forward and probably heightening the anxiety in public as well.
Sure. No. So all of our research is contemporary, but we can think about the role of journalists, right? I mean, in this story, journalists aren't the bad guys necessarily, right? So I think investigative journalism has the potential to tell people, here's this thing you've never thought about that you actually should be worried about because it affects people like you or it affects people you care about. And anxiety has to be relevant to one's life for you to feel it. But at the same time, we can think about journalism and yellow journalism and getting people to be more supportive of war, maybe under false pretenses, right? So there are ways in which media may play this role of getting you to feel anxious that may serve the public interest, but may not always serve the public interest.
Even though marketing here has gone on forever, whether it's politics or religion or whatever, they've done it from whatever. But where you measure or how can there be an end game to the amount that goes on in today's world? Because like you mentioned, newspapers, way back then, it was either the Pony Express or you got a newspaper or people didn't get the newspaper and they didn't hear it. Today, everything's 24/7, everywhere you go. So it's constant bombardment of this. Where ethically do you draw the line for what's best for human beings, and I don't know who we are, human beings in general, as opposed to always out to promote their own, something for their own gain? Where does that, who can that line be drawn with free speech and free press and free everything? Who ever draws that line?
Great. So one thing I'll tell you is that the fact that you're here at a talk about politics on a Tuesday night suggests to me that you are not a typical American. And so this is one of the things that it is true that the information environment, it will bombard you. But I do think it is worth thinking that many, many people opt out of politics altogether all the time, right? And so avoidance is a coping mechanism to anxiety or the potential for politics, right? And so, again, I kid, but you're not typical in that there is as much information now as you might want, but you are already self-selected into wanting more information. And so thinking about how you can kind of regulate your own information seeking may mean kind of you have to tune it out sometimes. But I think your question is also from the perspective of people who are producing this information, and at what point are we ethically concerned? And I do think journalists struggle with this, about how you cover things that are threatening to people without going overboard. And I think part of so I'll tell you, and journalists in different places do this in different ways. So I'll tell you just a quick story. So Leonora told you that I'm working on this project with some European colleagues on looking at the effect of terrorism on public attitudes in Europe and the US. One of my jobs in this project was to write scary stories about terrorism, and my colleagues and then we put them on a survey in these 5 different countries that we're studying. And so I wrote a story about a potential terrorist attack that was based on a story that Fox News had run. And I changed it in a variety of ways. And then I sent it to my Norwegian colleague. And she said, well, I'm going to take this to my friend who writes for a newspaper in Oslo, and then we're going to see how this would play in Norway before we put this on the survey. And this Norwegian journalist looked at this story and she said, we would never, ever run something like this. Because it has no information in it. It has no content, right? It just has allegations in it. And so I think that there are different there are different schools of thought as to whether the public needs to know, but the other thing to think about is that what does the public need to know? And I think journalists and governments have very different views on this, about whether or not people need to know that there is some allegation of a threat somewhere that may harm you, or whether or not they want to keep that information private. And I don't know that we have a good sense of where our government stands on that. But certainly our journalists tend to put more information out that may not have multiple government sources, right? And this Norwegian journalist was like, nope, we wouldn't. So we changed it before we put it on our survey to reflect more what the kind of newspapers in Europe would look like. I don't know that answers the question. I don't know what the line is, right? And I do think we should have real concerns about free speech and about what the press is. I am very concerned when I hear people saying things that we should censor the press, because more information tends to be better. But it is a question of how we can filter out what is concerning.
I need a little more clarification on when you say party owns the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Could you clarify just what does that mean?
Sure. That means that when I ask on a survey, or Gallup asks on a survey, which party is better at handling this issue, the party gets more people who say, so it's this question, okay? Which party could do a better job dealing with, say, terrorism, right? And if you ask this question over time, you see basically the same thing over and over and over again. The parties have different issues that they're seen as better on. That does not mean that people necessarily endorse the policies of that party, but it is the issues that the party tends to run on. It has something to do with the constituency of the party, and it is issues that people also give more leeway to the party to deal with in say, in Congress. Did that help?
I'm glad you went back to that slide, because I did have a question about it, which was showing you, and that is, just looking at the column on the right there, the pluses and minuses, it seems like the Democrats have a stronger ownership of the issues that they own.
Sure.
The strongest Republican one, there's 12. So I was just wondering if you could say anything about that, just how that happens.
I think it's partially about some of these are issues where, so some of these, the economy is one where actually you see flip-flops. So some of these are about, less about rhetoric and more about actual government performance. And so some of these, like the economy tends to go back and forth and taxes tend to go back and forth based on what's happening in politics. The environment and healthcare, these are ones that Democrats tend to run on, or they run on if they're smart, because like you pointed out, these are ones where there's much bigger ownership among the Democrats. And some of these, again, are ones where there's a bit more, looking at this again, I'm very surprised by this immigration one, because that's one that has really been a kind of strong Republican issue for a long time and has recently changed. So there's this argument that Chris Flasian and others make that politics is thermostatic. That is, we get too far, we go too far in a kind of in a conservative direction, and the public kind of reels back government into a liberal direction. We get too liberal, we kind of go back toward the center or to the conservative end. And I think what you're seeing here is some of that thermostat, right? Is the kind of, when things are going a bit too far, even if you think the party had ownership, if they pushed too far, say with separating children from their parents at the border, then you get this kind of pullback, right? Whereas on some of these, you're getting less of that kind of performance measure.
Who came up with that list
Who?
of topics?
This is from the Pew Research Center. Right. But you can look, there's, the American National Election Studies asked about this as well. Are you thinking there's something that's missing on
I
this?
just wondered, race isn't on there, and that's such a huge issue right now in the country. Gay rights isn't on there.
Sure.
Those kind of, that's why I just wanted.
Social issues.
Yeah, the social issues.
Sure.
But yet other social issues die.
Right. I mean, I think partially when Pew and other survey houses put these on there, they are partially trying to keep up with their time series. So these are probably ones they have asked about in the past, and they want to see how they've changed. But sometimes it's just about how much time they have on the survey.
If there's another hand, I'm going to pick up on your thermostat reference. So, since the World Trade Center, in the media now, for years we've been hearing war without end. So I guess, so just picking up on that, if we're having this extended period, like World War I, World War II began and ended again. Remember the main Spanish-American War, going back to Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. How is that going to work with what we're talking about tonight? Just as far as people's sense of anxiety, if we're at war because we're anxious, well, we don't see the end of this war on terror. So something to say about that?
Sure, yeah, this is a great question. So John Mueller at Ohio State has some of the best work on this, and looking at, I was just reading one of his articles yesterday. So if you look at the concerns about terrorism from 9/11 forward, on national surveys, the anxiety about terrorism is pretty similar today as it was in 2001. And it goes up, it goes down, and then it goes back up, and after the Paris attacks in 2015, it went back up to levels we haven't seen since 2003, 2004, okay? And there's no real good reason for that, right? So he makes this argument that there's a whole industry that is, and you can agree or disagree, but his argument is essentially there's a kind of defense industry and politicians, again, who have incentives to keep people concerned about terrorism. And I do think part of it is we don't know what the end looks like. We don't know what victory looks like. We don't know what is protective at this point. We're going into, and we don't know what policies are effective, right? We've been in Afghanistan for 17 years, and I don't think that we know what policies are effective at this point. And certainly politicians want you to be afraid when they have a solution for you, but it's, again, unclear what the solution is at this point. So I think the other thing to think about is that since 9/11, we have been in a period of constant crisis where ratcheting up anxiety about terrorism is relatively easy. And I mean, I don't say that to be glib. I don't say that it's without cost. There's certainly psychic costs, and there's certainly costs to people's lives, particularly in the military. But we are in a period where both media and politicians find it relatively easy to push on those concerns that are already there about terrorism, to then say that we have solutions in other areas like immigration. It was me. I dropped my clicker over here. When they have solutions, right, it's often a solution in search of a problem. And so what could the problem be? Maybe it's national security.
you.
Thank you.